So what's wrong with Mavuika? Absolutely nothing. And that, for me, is the problem. From what I've seen online, the reaction to her release has been mostly positive, with a few small sections of the community feeling differently. And a lot of the discussion in those spaces in particular seem to be people just not understanding where others are coming from. I don't begrudge anyone who does like her, but I, unfortunately, do not. Normally, when a character is not for me, I end up just skipping them and that's that. A few times someone has asked me whether I ever have anything negative to say about characters, and while the answer is yes, I generally only review characters I have, and since I only pull for ones I like, I end up never creating content about characters that I don't like. In Mavuika's case, many people seem confused why anyone would dislike her in the first place, and several have asked me why I'm skipping her. Since I don't see much content which chimes with my perspective, for once it feels worthwhile for me to share my thoughts even though I don't have her in-game. As I prepare myself for the pitchforks, I'd just like to preface this by saying that you can like or even love Mavuika and I won't think any less of you. I'm not trying to change your mind in the slightest. Everything about this is inherently subjective. If you're interested in hearing an alternate perspective, then you're in the right place. If you're going to get upset if someone says anything remotely negative about your favorite flamehead waifu, then you might not be. Note that since this discussion focuses on her character more than anything else, this will contain full spoilers up to and including Act 5 of the Natlan Archon quest and Mavuika's story quest. Naturally, Mavuika was front and center from the moment Hoyo started promoting Natlan. Our first glimpse of her was in the Ignition teaser trailer, which showcased the designs of the upcoming playable characters from the new region. Personally, I was underwhelmed by the entire Ignition teaser on 2 counts. First, I wasn't a big fan of many of the designs, but Genshin's aesthetic choices do often grow on me over time. Second, what I really wanted was some hint at the characters' personalities, and felt that we got nothing. Without knowing their personalities, I felt little reason to care. Mavuika in particular was divisive from the very first moment. Many loved her bold and striking design and thought that her much more modern aesthetic lent her vivid contrast against the rest of the game. I was on the other side. She felt out of place to me, even next to the other Natlan characters, though I was more worried about her hair physics in-game since that's often bothered me for characters with similar hairs in Genshin. While I wasn't excited, I always give characters a chance even if they don't look like they're for me at first glance. To give a couple of examples, one of my least favorite designs is Chevreuse, but since I loved her personality and enjoyed her teams, I happily pulled her and use her all the time. Or Yelan, who I just had zero interest in terms of personality and appearance, but whose gameplay felt so much fun I just had to have her. Some people decided to skip from the very moment they first saw Mavuika, but personally, I reserved my judgment. We met her early on in the Archon quest, and there was a lot to like about her. It was refreshing for the Traveler and Paimon to meet a new Archon and find that they are open and friendly from the start, and readily take them into their confidence. By this point in their journey, it makes sense for their reputation to precede them, and for it to win much trust. A great way to show us that their travels so far have left their mark on the world of Teyvat. Early on, we see 2 sides of Mavuika. In public, she's an endlessly confident and charismatic leader who can effortlessly hold the attention of a crowd in the palm of her hand. In private, she's still an endlessly confident and charismatic leader, but she also cares deeply about her nation's plight and the individuals around her. There were also hints at a potential character flaw. She came across as a bit reckless, always forging forwards without hesitation. As introductions go, it was pretty great. I still felt that her design was out of place, but in terms of personality, she felt like what we'd expect from a Pyro Archon. After all, unlike all the other Archons, she's only human. As a quick aside before we move on, if anyone really understands her lore, could they please explain it in the comments? The interpretation which seems most accurate to me is that she was a human who lived over 500 years ago who won the status of Natlan's Archon. After waging war against the Abyss, she put a plan into motion which required her to sacrifice her life in order to be reborn in the future at a time when the ancient names of her heroic friends had all re-emerged and together defeat the enemy once and for all. However, I've seen so many people say that her hypercompetence is explained by her being over 500 years old, yet the animated short shows her drifting in limbo for all that time, though the short does also include her bike even though Shilonen, who made it, was not even born yet, so it may just be style and metaphor. The in-game dialogue that I remember stated that she lived a normal human life, skipped through time, and then emerged in the present. I've dug through her lore in the wiki and found absolutely nothing. Was she reborn with just the experiences gained through her original human lifespan, or did her consciousness subjectively experience 500 years? And if she did, was that time spent gaining experiences, or just stuck in limbo which slowly wore away at her memories like the short seems to show? Many of the arguments against the character criticisms we'll explore later start from the statement, but she has 500 years of experience. And my first thought is always, but does she really? Before we dive further into her personality, let's skip ahead to when she was released as a playable character and look through her kit, why it's great for some people and why it just doesn't work for me. The big surprise of Mavuika's kit is, of course, that she rides a gigantic red futuristic motorbike and then attacks people with it. Throughout Natlan, one common thread across most of the playable characters is that, for me at least, they all seem a little out of place in the setting. Tevat is a fantasy world, and with the right world building, literally anything could feel natural and justified. So far, the entire world is filled with evidence of highly advanced civilizations, though much of it is crumbling ruins of a forgotten era which passed millennia ago. And while most of the world seems roughly medieval era, some kinds of tech have been front and center in the most recent nations. It was less prominent in Mondstadt, Liyue, and Inazuma, but has become much more visible since then. In Sumeru, we had the Akasha, which was basically a Magitech internet, while in Fontaine, we had the Mecha and other steampunk technology. In both of these cases, the tech was powered by magic and embedded into the world. It was visible and present throughout the entire nation, woven deeply into the story, and came up as an important plot point with its implications explored from different perspectives, especially in Sumeru. In Natlan, in my view, the tech doesn't fit. Each of the playable characters uses something unique, and none of the tech they have is used by other members of their tribes. It's completely absent from the landscape and designs of the world or the shape of their cultures. It's often visually distinct from the aesthetic of the rest of the nation, and the fact that these few people each have something the rest of the world lacks is never relevant to the story and is rarely even commented on. Aside from the enemies using them in battle, why is everyone not zooming around on a sharky surfboard or zipping through the air on magical grapples? In the real world, tech like this would be used to solve tons of everyday problems. They could have made this work. For example, imagine if the millennia of war had driven Natlan to become much more technologically advanced than the other nations. A hidden technotopia like Wakanda could have fit the rest of the world, and in that alternate universe, all the Natlan characters' designs would have felt appropriate, especially Mavuika's. Either way, her Flame Strider dials that up to 11. Her bike is gigantic and looks like a sci-fi hyperbike more than anything else. According to its lore, it's based on a fusion of various blueprints Mavuika found from long-lost civilizations with modern techniques invented or improved by Shilonen. But then, why is she the only one who has anything even remotely this advanced? And why does it look like a modern world bike when half of the robots from that era, which supposedly inspired it, are literally able to hover? So, to me, it feels very out of place, and some people even feel that the Flame Strider's mere existence ruins Tevat for them. But on a fundamental level, that really doesn't matter. I felt largely the same when Chaska's boomstick was revealed, but ended up pulling for her anyway because I loved her design and personality and got over the fundamental silliness of a cowgirl riding a giant magic revolver and ended up enjoying her a ton. Even though I disliked Mavuika's design, disliked her bike, and was lukewarm on her personality in the early stages of the plot, I still gave her a fair chance once her trial came around. I was hoping to skip to save my primos, but if she had been as fun as someone like Yelan had been for me, then I probably would have pulled for her and just gotten used to the bike over time. So, let's talk about her trial. Mavuika is a Claymore user with fast and aggressive normal attacks which are noticeably more crisp and responsive than most others who use this weapon type. This is one part of her kit which actually felt really good for me, but sadly they're pretty much useless and are not actively part of how she's played. Instead, her main thing is her elemental skill. Her tap version triggers coordinated attacks, while her hold version summons her bike. Moving around with it felt really janky to me, unfortunately. I expected it to feel like it has some weight, some traction, and some sense of acceleration, but it felt like a hover bike instead. Its handling in particular felt off to me. Part of this is likely because the bike pivots around its center, and part is that it's very sensitive and veers dramatically once you start leaning into a turn. Its handling is, to some extent, a superficial problem which would fade into the background once you've gotten used to it, but it was not a good start. Her normal attacks while riding the bike, I just cannot take seriously. She leaps and bounds around and smashes into enemies with her bike, and sometimes swings her sword as an afterthought. When doing this, the bike feels clunky and unwieldy, and I just straight up dislike it. And for her charge attacks while riding the bike, which are actually her strongest playstyle, she does donuts, zooming around in circles. This felt even worse to me. There's no sense of impact when the bike hits an enemy, adjusting position felt even more clunky, and overall it just felt unengaging and didn't hold my interest. It bears emphasizing that the feel of how a character plays is super subjective, and something that feels horrible to one person can feel incredible to another. Many people absolutely love Mavuika's motorbike attacks and find her fun and engaging. Sadly for me, that just doesn't work. Her burst has a unique quirk. It doesn't use elemental energy and instead is powered up either when a character in the team consumes Night Soul points or very slowly when someone hits enemies with normal attacks. In theory, I like the idea of changing things up by making a character who doesn't require any energy at all and uses some other mechanic to charge up their burst. It could open up a ton of possibilities for unique interactions between different characters. However, I hate how Mavuika is restricted to Nutland characters, since I suspect it's a way to push the other characters up the list. I feel sorry for all of those people who skip Shiloning to save for her, though I guess it'll just further boost Citlali's sales. After the initial explosion, the burst provides a great damage boost to normal and charge attack damage, so it dovetails really well with her attacking style, while also providing the option of buffing other characters when using Mavuika as an off-field burst support, as long as you tie her to another from Natlan. Which leads to the final relevant point when it comes to her kit. She's ludicrously strong. This is something I find a little perplexing about the Genshin community. I personally would prefer it if Hoyo kept things well balanced and new characters were relevant because they introduced compelling new playstyles, unlocked new teams, and made existing characters more fun to play. Meanwhile, large portions of the community get hyped by seeing ever bigger numbers. While I totally get how that could be an adrenaline rush, I'm already a little concerned that the balancing is starting to tip over, and Mavuika's sheer strength definitely plays into that concern. Even at low investment, she power creeps pretty much everyone else in the game. If Hoyo avoid HP inflation and still cater to the people who don't pull for power, then this is all good fun. If they do ratchet up the inflation, then this is an aspect of Mavuika's kit which could potentially contribute to people slowly drifting away from the game. Whether or not you enjoy a character's playstyle is highly subjective, and my impression is that the majority of people loved Mavuika's. I personally found it visually unappealing and mechanically unsatisfying, and every time she started zooming around in the cutscenes as an incarnation of pure flames, I couldn't help but imagine how much more fun that would have been. But hey, she's an optional character in a game where I've already got almost 70 others fully built and waiting to play with. So now onto the main course, her character. I've been thinking about her from two perspectives: the type of character they were probably aiming for, and the type of character they ended up creating. I've seen a lot of people complain about Mavuika's lack of character arc, and while I do agree that stories about characters who go through some change tend to be compelling, stories about static characters can be just as good when done right. Some of the most iconic characters of all time do not change much throughout their story: Sherlock Holmes, Indiana Jones, or even Maximus Meridius. In these stories, the protagonist remains more or less static, so many might expect them to be dull and boring, but the key is that something else makes them compelling. In classic Sherlock stories, the mystery keeps us entertained, and his deft solutions are the payoff to all the setup. Indie films are all about him discovering what the bad guys are up to and figuring out some way to stop them despite being just a little on the rougher side of competence. Gladiator shows Maximus holding on to his moral integrity and his belief that Rome should be the light shining in the darkness despite facing the worst of a corrupt world which constantly tries to beat him down. Hoyo clearly wanted Mavuika to be iconic and unchanging, even in Act 5, and they thought that an action-packed war against our age-old enemy would be sufficient to keep us entertained. For many, it worked, particularly for those who love shonen tropes and don't mind it when a story only shows the final act. But for the rest of us, it fell short, at least in part due to what felt like poor pacing and lack of tension. When people try to figure out what went wrong in that final act, Mavuika's lack of growth stands out and ends up getting much of the blame. But if Hoyo had done the rest of the story well, few would have been so disappointed. The other major complaint about Mavuika's character is that she lacks any flaws. The dreaded accusation Mary Sue is often thrown around. Unfortunately, Mary Sue is one of the most loaded terms anyone can use when talking about characters. It comes from a Star Trek parody fanfic, and even in the initial source, there are several valid interpretations of what the character was intended to critique. From then on, it's just grown further, and as a result, people take this term to mean completely different things. Fandoms often interpret it to mean an audience surrogate or self-insert character in a wish fulfillment story. Meanwhile, in writing circles, it's more likely to mean a character who lacks flaws, is inexplicably competent, or is automatically adored by anyone who isn't an outright villain. Two different takes on that are particularly relevant to Mavuika: the Infallible character and the Idealised character. An infallible character is one who never fails. Anything they try goes precisely to plan, and they never make mistakes. Sometimes this can be masked by showing the character fail at things which are irrelevant to their main course. For example, struggling to learn something, while they remain flawlessly competent when tackling their true goals. Mavuika is a quintessential example of this. She's hyper-competent at everything she tries. Just look at her first character story, which explicitly states that in some cases, Mavuika surpasses masters with decades of experience after studying a skill just for a single year. I read through her lore in the wiki to get a better feel for her as a character, since that's often where Hoyo likes to stash the real depth they don't quite manage to pull off in the quests, but honestly, it was bafflingly over the top to the point that I started feeling like I was reading ChatGPT's attempt at inventing a backstory for an epic, infallible leader. This plays out in the Archon quest and her story quest, where every decision she makes pays off flawlessly. As mentioned earlier, the common excuse I've seen people make for this is that of course everything goes well because she's been planning this for 500 years. But was she really conscious and actively planning for that entire time? And since when does even the best laid plan work out flawlessly? Regardless of whether it's justified in the lore, a character who is completely infallible sucks the tension out of the story, because as soon as it becomes clear that they are completely unable to fail, then the rest of the narrative becomes just a bland victory lap. Genshin already struggles to maintain tension even when the characters do make mistakes, since it's pretty clear that things will work out in the end. A truly infallible character like Mavuika makes that even worse. An idealized character is one who either has no flaws or whose flaws are positive traits in disguise, similar to the age-old answer in job interviews, "My only flaw is that I'm a workaholic." From what I've seen, people consider Mavuika's main flaws to be that she's stubborn, reckless, and cares too much. All three of these could have been viable flaws which would have made for some interesting tension in the story, but due to her infallibility, they never caused any issues whatsoever, and for me, and many others, they don't feel like an integral part of her personality. We're told these flaws exist, but never shown them. Mavuika's stubborn streak could have reared its head if not for the fact that literally everyone else always agrees with her. Only Capitano spent any significant time arguing against her, and even he gave up with barely a shrug. A character being reckless kinda requires them to not have everything go perfectly for them at all times. In the same way that courage without fear is merely confidence, recklessness without risk of failure is just pure competence. And caring too much, of course, sits squarely within the "I'm totally a workaholic" category of so-called flaws. But if done right, it could have legitimately added tension and raised the stakes. For one thing, maybe she could have felt conflicted when sending her friends off to potential death, since they're at risk even with the protection of the Ode of Resurrection. Instead, nothing. Or imagine if, when her sister's soul appears before her, Mavuika breaks down. Here is the soul of a person she cares so much about that she could have struggled to even bear the thought of leaving her behind once more. This would have been the time for the power of friendship to lift her up in a truly authentic and moving moment, as support from her friends could have helped her steel herself and take that next step towards the final battle. Instead, all we got was an oddly cheerful chat, and then Mavuika continues on, ever the stoic hero. Or imagine if Gazoithoth, after the initial dragon phase of the battle, had transformed to take the forms of Mavuika's friends, and she had struggled to continue the fight. She could have soldiered on in increasing distress, only for it to take the form of her sister at the end, leading to her needing our help to overcome the enemy. An enemy taking this strength and turning it into a weakness could have been an interesting twist, and would have made Mavuika more sympathetic for many people without changing her essence. Instead, even though she supposedly sacrifices everything meaningful to her, she shows barely any emotion when confronted with what she's lost, so to me, it just seemed like she didn't really care. Another slight twist on that flaw, which I've seen mentioned, is that she believes in others too much, and it can be hard to live up to her expectations. This is another flaw which never backfires, as Mavuika's belief and pep talks invariably ensure that the people she believes in always prove her right. Even her hypercompetence could have been shown as a double-edged sword. We could have been shown that her compulsion to be the best stems from a deep-rooted insecurity, for example, or that it separates her from her subjects when all she wants is a deeper and more personal connection. There are so many subtle tweaks that could have turned her into a more nuanced character without changing her core essence, but they were all ignored. And inevitably, people bring up the other Archons and how several of them are somewhat static characters. For me, they work better in their respective stories, but it's also pretty clear that they all have their flaws. Venti cares, but wallows in his trauma and drinks himself insensate just to dull the pain. Zhongli is calculated and reserved, but while he does have a sentimental side, he struggles to understand the lives of his subjects or empathize with their problems. Raiden is a ruthless tyrant, but we see her softer side via Yamiko's perspective. We see her grief and vulnerability, understand her arrogance, and then see her change for the better. Nahida has the wisdom of innocence, but is crippled by self-doubt and slowly comes to trust herself over the course of her story. Furina is an interesting one to compare Mavuika to, because the cores of their stories have many similarities, but where Mavuika knows the plan, Furina is largely in the dark and has no clue when her torture will end. And more importantly, we discover Furina's plight over the course of the quest, while Mavuika's is stated openly right from the start. In contrast to the other Archons, Archons, Mavuika never shows us a different side to herself. She's just a fearless leader through and through. Many people wanted to see an Archon who really lives up to the name, but even the most charismatic leader imaginable would be more compelling if they show some other facets to themselves. In a world where even the gods are flawed, Mavuika feels out of place to me. It could be argued that Hoyo were aiming for this to express the idea that a human Archon is better, since she can understand her subjects on a more fundamental level, but that intent does not explain her being so idealized. Even if she had a bunch of flaws but showed she was trying, she would already have been streets ahead of certain other Archons. Genshin does have other characters who are very static. It is, to some extent, a basic requirement for Hoyo to be able to market any given character properly, but it's more prominent in Mavuika's case than in others. For me, her story quest made zero difference on any of these points. I still can't quite get over how her fight against Xbalanque was declared a victory for Mavuika when they were clearly evenly matched, and then she goes out and boasts about it. Idealized or infallible characters can get a pass if the story is a power fantasy, where people are expected to self-insert into that character to large degree, which makes the experience cathartic and empowering. If Mavuika filled that role for you, then I totally understand why you loved every minute she was on the screen. Unfortunately, I just do not feel the same. Of course, there's always the chance that Hoyo could swoop in with a new chapter in this story, which completely turns all of her characterization upside down. There are hints that the true finale of Natlan's story is still to come. The name in the Pyro Gemstone's description is still obscured, the Gnosis is still in Mavuika's hands, and the Fatui will surely have some reaction to the effective death of the first of the Harbingers. So perhaps we are in the calm before the storm. Unfortunately, I just do not get the impression that this is the case. I feel like Hoyo bent all of their resources into making Mavuika overwhelmingly awesome, and neglected to showcase the depth which they intended to give her. Even the stories within her profile pages are astonishingly devoid of depth. Overall, I'm a little sad to skip an Archon, but since I don't like her design, don't like her playstyle, and don't really feel anything for her as a character, she was absolutely not for me. If you like her, then all power to you. I hope you get much joy out of her. Until next time!